Hello, I'm talking about the North-South divide in England and looking at lots of aspects about it. This is a talk given at the University of Durham in November 2024. How do we define the North and the South of England? One approximate way is to draw a line between the Severn and the Wash and say anything above that is the North, anything below that is the South. Or perhaps by county boundaries, so we go a bit further up. Or we exclude the Midlands. We're going to look at especially the northeast and the southeast. Let's focus on those two. If we look at annual income, we find great differences between London and the northeast, with others in between. But that doesn't tell the whole story. House prices, for example. In London, the average house price, 2023 I think it was, is 508,000, while in the northeast it's 158,000. So you need a bigger salary to buy somewhere to live in London. So instead of just annual pay, we take into account things like the cost of living per household. Now, note these are different from different sources. This is per household. But if we look at the cost of living, by the way, I think takes into account things like buying a house and so on. If we look at London, the cost of living is 31,000. In the northeast is 21,000. So there's a £10,000 difference there and a £12,000 difference there. So the difference perhaps doesn't seem so great. But that's an approximate thing, because this is per household, this is per person, different sources. Let's have another look at, from the same source as the annual pay, is the disposable income. That tells a slightly different story. Still a divide between disposable income of 18,000 in the northeast and 32,000 in London, with all sorts of others in between. So it's difficult to define what a north-south divide is. Let's have a look at productivity. Now, productivity is gross value added per hour worked, relative to the national average. In London, it's 26% above the national average. In the southeast, it's 10% above, but in the rest of the country, it's below the national average. 12% below in the northeast, 13% below in the West Midlands, 15, nearly 16% below in the East Midlands, 4% below in the East. In the Northwest it's nearly 7% below, and so on. So, what do we think about this? Productivity is low in the North and the East and the Southwest perhaps, and it's high in the Southeast and London. So what do we make of this? Is it that, oh, all these people up here are just lazy and they're depending on benefits and they are unproductive? No. See, London has the finance industry. So you spend an hour and you add multiple millions to the economy, whereas an hour here you add real work to the economy. This is funny money, so forget it. such figures are often meaningless. Let's go to health. Is there a division in health? Let's have a look at asthma. The red figures, the red A's, indicate the 10 worst places for asthma in the UK, and the green indicate the 5 best, these in terms of local authorities. So you can see in terms of asthma, less asthma is in the northeast. Let's have a look at blood pressure, high blood pressure. Now here, Manchester, I think it is, has a fairly good blood pressure rating, but everywhere else in the north and also in the southwest is within the lowest, the worst, 5 worst, whereas the 5 best are again in the southeast, except for this one. COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. These are all the best in the southeast, and all the worst are in the north. Epilepsy, obesity, peripheral arterial disease. See the picture? The best of the health is in the southeast, and the worst is in the northwest and a few other places. Now let's look at mental health in the same way. Dementia. Depression. Serious mental illness. Interestingly, in London is the worst for serious mental illness, but apart from that, it's mainly in the north. So you get the picture. There is a division between the north and the south. Is it to do with lifestyle, perhaps? See, in the north there's less physical activity, a physical energy expenditure, more smoking and more alcohol. Actually, there's the difference in physical energy expenditure is not so much between the north and the south as between urban and rural. People in towns tend to have less exercise than rural people. Is this the reason why there's worse health in the north than in the south? Well, maybe partly, but the differences between these are not great. Now let's have a look at some immeasurables, things we can't really measure by numbers. Let's have a look at opinions. How do the north and the south think of each other? The northerners think of the southern people as fairies and never do a good day's work, and they spend too much time and money in their wine bars. Southerners think of northern people as monkeys, uncultured, uncouth, and you can't understand what they say. Friendliness. Mainly anecdotal, but lots of people are saying people in the north are much more friendly than people in the south. Notice how green is good and that sort of dark red is not so good. Soil fertility. It's lower in the north, higher in the south. Why? Because an awful lot of the north is moorland. Landscape. It's tamer in the south, it's wild and wonderful in the north, especially on these moors. An awful lot of the south, especially the southeast, is suburban or urban. I've lived down in Southampton, and I just felt oppressed all the time I was there. 14 years I was there. I come from Scotland, you see, but moved from Southampton up to this area, and this is much better. You see, I love going walking, bird watching, things like that, and I used to go out in the New Forest, thinking it was it would be a place, a wild place and so on. But no, it's you can't escape the sound of traffic. You keep on coming across human-made stuff like car parks and so on. Oh, I just found that life down here was oppressive. I'd far rather have less money and live up here. And you see, the outdoors is more accessible up here. You can get out of cities, whereas down here, oh, you just can't get out of these things. But does this do any good? Only good for mental health. It is good for mental health, but only if we use it. So there's another difference, tipped in favour of the north. Geography and topology, geology, sorry. In the north, there's a lot of coal and minerals iron. In the south, there's very little, except for a bit of coal, the Kent coal fields. So, what happened? What tended to happen was that the south consumed all these things mined in the north. This gave a difference in occupation. Let's look at the history. Going back, 800 years or whatever, 1500 years, there were the Celts and Britons and or whatever, and then in about 500 CE AD, the Angles and Saxons came over from sort of like northern Germany, Denmark, and so on. Then the Vikings came over. The Vikings, interestingly, had a slave culture. They were conquerors. And then the Normans came, and the Normans are probably they brought with them their culture, and they had been Vikings about 200 years before, settling in northern France, and they brought with them the elitism and slavery, slightly softened by Christianity, into an aristocracy and serfdom rather than pure slavery. The Normans were the aristocrats, the Anglo-Saxons were the serfs. And that, incidentally, brought in the English class system. But the aristocracy has remained always down here. During the Middle Ages, aristocracy would gain estates up here, but really they kept on coming down to the courts in London. And London, where the seat of the sovereign was always seen as a superior place. Beginnings of the north-south divide. But let's have a look. Then what happened? You see, William the Norman conquered the Anglo-Saxons in this area, and then he came up, and the people in the north refused to acknowledge him as king. So he went up with a cruel campaign of harrying the north. That is, laying waste to the north, burning whole villages and communities, burning crops, burning tools, burning all sorts of things, so that after this, the north was deprived of all its resources. And this was during the winter of 1069 to 70, and it's something like 100,000 people starved out of a population of, about 4.5 million. Huge proportion of the population starved because of what William the Norman had done. He was in some ways a good king, in other ways, but here he was terrible. Then a few centuries later, the War of the Roses between the House of Lancaster and the House of York again laid waste to the north. And then some centuries later came the Industrial Revolution, and heavy industry was focused in the north because of all the minerals and so on being mined, fueled by coal. And so the people of the north became heavy industrial people, coal miners, used to dangerous jobs, hard working, while the people in the south just consumed. And then in the 1980s came de-industrialisation of Margaret Thatcher. And again destroyed the north. Not only, destroyed much of what the north had relied on economically. And so a huge number of people became dependent on the state. They were just put out of work. North-South divide. No wonder there's a sense of injustice in the north. And it's met by not concern and empathy, but by self-centered unconcern in the south. Because a lot of the south look to Europe, and London wants to be like Paris, and just sees the north as a resource to allow it to play on the world stage. No wonder there's feelings of injustice, and a grudge is held. Culture. That's a little bit more positive. King in 2000 suggested there's a culture of making do in the north and a culture of dependency in the south. More friendly and the more generous culture in the north, whereas in the south it's me and my family against others, and a bit of dependency on the family. There's snobbishness in the south, but met by anger in the north. These are the negative things. These are positive. So there's a different culture. It's almost, so it's been said by somebody that they are really just like two separate countries. However, not all is divided. The Russell Group universities. There's around 9 or 10 in the south, 9 or 10 in the north, and 3 along the boundary. So, no, there's no north-south divide in distribution of Russell Group universities. So how are we going to understand all this, and understand all these things that we've been talking about, geology and fertility and health and mental health and research, and history and industry and language and friendliness and income and art and law and culture and so on, injustice? Here I'm going to introduce you to the aspects of everyday experience by the Dutch thinker Herman Dooyeweerd. Each aspect is a sphere of meaning and sphere of law, and has a kernel meaning and a constellation of meaning around it. Each is an irreducibly distinct sphere of meaning. So kernel meanings are quantitative is amount. Think of what we're doing at the moment, or think of me you listening to this, me making this up. A certain amount of stuff to put over. There's arrangement of stuff on the screen, perhaps. Movement. Well, I use movement as to mean something. I don't know whether you've guessed. There's physical aspect of energy, fields and forces. Now, in talking to you, you're seeing light. As I'm talking, my voice box makes vibrations in the air. And that's the physical aspect of a talk. The biotic aspect, it's done living. You're living. If we were dead, we wouldn't be conversing. I'm an organism, you're an organism. There's a sensory aspect, feeling and responding. So we're seeing, hearing, and I am doing things with the mouse. Analytic, we're distinguishing and focusing. Now hear the sounds around you. You were probably not aware much of the sounds around you. You were hearing them, but in focusing, you are hearing my voice. You are functioning in the analytic aspect, which is being aware of something and cutting out everything else, whereas the sensory aspect is hearing everything. There's the formative aspect, the formative power, which is to do with human making, human planning, achieving. It's to do with techniques, technology. It's also the aspect of history. The history is seen not just as dates, but as human beings doing things, achieving things that are notable. The lingual aspect is that of symbolic signification, that is, conveying meaning by symbols, whether it's text or speech or movement or gestures or boundary stones. These are all lingual, intending to convey meaning to others or to oneself later on, and making notes to oneself. Then there's a social aspect of not just inter-individual, but a group of us agreeing. We're assembling together, institutions, friends, friendliness, and so on. Now, this talk is putting over concepts which are distinguished from one another. These concepts are structured. This is not just a random set of concepts. They convey meaning, but the meaning is agreed, like a common language. I'm treating you as people, not just information sinks. I could just read a text in front of you, and you get the same information, but I'm trying to make it more meaningful to you as human beings. Economics, conserving things, trading. Conserving, we have limited screen space, so I'm trying to use it well. With limited time, I don't want to take hours and hours of your time. Is it interesting? Is it enjoyable? Or harmonizing? Does the whole thing hang together? Am I doing justice to the topic? Am I doing justice to you? Are you doing justice to me, listening? Going beyond doing justice, giving more, being generous. Ethical doesn't just mean right and wrong, it means going beyond. What is goodness? So a good person is not just someone who does justice and obeys the law, goes beyond. And finally, the pistic aspect from the Greek word pistis, pistin, meaning what we actually believe, not what we say we believe, but what we actually believe, as of ultimate meaningfulness. What we take for granted, what we assume, what we expect, what we aspire to, up to ultimate meaning and giving our lives for, as in religion. Human life is a functioning in all these aspects together. And they relate to each other. They are irreducibly distinct, and yet there is fundamental relationships among all the aspects. So, for example, we trade. If we trade, we agree on a price, and we speak to one another to agree the price. But also, we are functioning in the juridical aspect. Is it a just price or an unjust price? And similarly for all the other aspects. Now, this is going to help us, I believe, understand the North-South divide. The divide itself is, of course, spatial. And we measure it by differences in amount, less and more, and figures. But then all these other things that we've been talking about, the geology is a physical North-South divide. Difference in soil fertility is biotic. Difference in health is biotic. Difference in mental health is a sensory north-south divide. The research universities, research is an analytical activity, and there ain't so much of a divide here. Industry, more industry, heavy industry in the north than in the south. That's meaningful in the formative aspect, and also history is meaningful in the formative aspect. Language, dialect, difference in dialect is a lingual difference. Difference in friendliness is a social difference. Difference in income and in house prices is an economic difference. Different in art and leisure and occupations is an aesthetic difference. Justice is a juridical issue. Difference in generosity is ethical, and culture to do with what is most meaningful in life. So we can understand all these things, all these different divides, as divides, different aspects of the north-south divide. And it's useful to separate them out like this. Useful to separate them out. And so take, for example, the history. What's going on, if you remember? Take William the Norman coming over and conquering. He was motivated by greed, I think, but also he was given permission to invade England from the Pope, religious thing, because the Pope wanted England to follow the right religion, not so much the Celtic religion that there had been before, the Celtic Christianity. But what did he do? His separation of aristocrats from serfs was a social, was something he did in the social aspect. We today tend to think of it as oppression and therefore a juridical problem, just injustice, but that's only because we think of power relations as important, whereas in those days people seem to be happier. It's basically a social difference, although we could argue about that. But then there was the harrying of the north, where he was being mean, cruel. This is the ethical aspect, totally unethical, and the outcome was economic. Destruction of resources, destruction of food, destruction of the means of living in the tools, destruction of homes. It was also a social dysfunction, a social evil, destruction of communities, destruction of families, all motivated by greed and kind of hatred, because people wouldn't succumb to him, a bit of a social thing. So we can start to see how these things, the complexity, we can separate out the aspects that are happening. See, each aspect is not just a category. It is a norm, at least from the biotic onwards. You can differentiate a good from a bad. Responsiveness versus inertness. Clarity versus obfuscation. Confusion. Achieving something rather than laziness. Communication rather than good communication rather than deceit. Friendship rather than enmity. Frugality rather than waste. Harmonizing rather than fragmenting. And I suppose enjoying rather than being bored. Justice rather than injustice, self-giving rather than selfishness, belief rather than idolatry, hidden agendas, and so on. All these things, as we function in all these aspects, we are functioning well or we are functioning badly. And the fundamental idea is what we call the shalom principle, that if we function well in all aspects, then things will go well, and if we function badly in some aspects, then that undermines the Hebrew word shalom, the Arabic word salam, kind of a peace, prosperity, well-being of life. Now these, you see, can show what is wrong in the north-south divide, what went wrong, and it can also guide us in overcoming. So, and I've highlighted the last two aspects because they are usually hidden. They are usually so an attitude of self-giving rather than selfishness. It affects all we do. These two affect all we do by inter-aspect relationships, dependency, and so on. So if we are selfish, that's going to affect our friendships, going to affect our what we buy. It's going to affect the laws we pass as a government or as a king. It's going to affect our communication. Selfishness might make us lazy. You know, remember the hard-working northern people versus these southern fairies who never do a full day's work. Well, I think southern people do a full day's work. It's just a different type of work. Except for the financiers in the City of London, who do inhabit the wine bars, and they make all this money just out of money. Selfishness and greed and unconcern for the others. This is a dysfunction in the ethical aspect and brings about problems. And then idolatry versus good belief, good assumptions, good commitments to the truth. Idolatry is where we elevate something above all other things and sacrifice other things to it. So London has long sacrificed the rest of the country for its own interests, trying to suck up to France and Paris or seem great on the world stage. These aspects, I think, are the ones we need to look at if we are going to overcome something of the north-south divide. We can't do anything about the physicality, but we can do something about health and illness and mental illness. We can do something about if the difference in productivity is to do with laziness. I don't think it is. But we can actually look at it. The formative aspect says, look at this. See whether it really is that. And I think it's not. The economic difference and prosperity. All these things, the government levelling up agenda is a solution, tries to be an economic solution, just pouring money in. But a lot of it is wasted. We need a change of attitude and a change of mindset if we're going to overcome the north-south divide. Thank you for listening.